Hadouken!
Hi there, Clem speaking from Escape Studio, Pearson College London. Today we're going to talk about cinematography for visual effects. This webinar is actually related to a course which I will be leading in January from the 8th. It's an evening course, 7 to 10 p.m., Monday and Wednesday. There will be a second session in October if you can't join us for the January workshop. So, here is the what, who, why, and how about that cinematography for visual effect course. So quickly, what? Well, the idea is to shoot your own visual effect shot, but also, and probably first and foremost, to learn about the camera and the visual effect techniques. So who is that for? Well, the course is dedicated to visual effect artists, visual effect supervisors, filmmakers, and cinematographers alike. Here is briefly why. The idea, for instance, as a VFX artist, is to achieve the best of your ability to really get at the top of your craft, you necessarily have to know what images are made of. Because at the end of the day, whether we are cinematographers, filmmakers, VFX artists, 2D, 3D, we are all making the same image. So therefore, to achieve the best possible, the most convincing image in terms of visual effect, it is very important, essential actually, for VFX artists to know what that image is made of, to know what the camera lenses parameters are actually made of. So to know the tools is one thing, but to know how to put the image together in a very credible way, that's another. And that requires to have that intimate knowledge of cinematography. So regarding VFX Supervisor, that's probably even more important because VFX Supervisor are actually the VFX people sent on set to make sure that what's being recorded is suitable for the VFX process that follows. So therefore, same thing, the VFX Supervisor needs to have extremely good knowledge on both sides, the VFX obviously, but also what it takes to create an image in front of the camera. Regarding filmmakers and cinematographers, well, this is actually my own experience, and I will tell you a little bit about in a minute. I actually started behind the cameras and worked in the camera department for 11 years as a camera operator, and realized that gradually I got to do more and more VFX shots, so stuff like chroma key, green screen, and so on. And therefore, whether you're established filmmaker, indie filmmakers, or cinematographer, it's likely that these days you're going to have to do a little bit of visual effect, or maybe you consider it. And therefore, it's probably a good idea to enhance a little bit your knowledge in that field. So that's what we're going to do. So that essentially also addressed the why, the reason why, but I'm going to go into detail about that why in a minute and within this hour or so. We'll have a look also at how we're going to do that, so in practical terms. So briefly, we'll be doing filming, hands-on filming. We're going also to have a look at case studies, so actual existing shot, how this shot have been made, and how we can replicate them, for instance. And also we'll go through the full workflow round trip, as I said, is essentially going from previs to the production and all the way down to post-production. So the complete creation of the shot from the beginning to the end. All right. So again, if you want to have a look at the specs of the course, well, essentially you can go online and check the details, but roughly, as I said, evening course, 2 days a week, 4 weeks, 7 to 10 p.m. This is Escape Studio, London West Campus, so Shepherd's Bush. And altogether, that's 24 hours of filmmaking and cinematography for visual effects. So, well, the guy that's going to be running the show is me. And the reason why I'm doing that is simply because it essentially reflects my own journey, my professional journey, from the camera to visual effects. So just to give you a little bit of a flavor of what I used to do, there you go. So that's the sort of shots I was involved in. That's actually a little clip filmed by my camera assistant at the time. We were in Prague, and Prague at the time was standing acting for Paris. There was 12 cameras involved in that sequence, which is kind of old-fashioned stunt sequence. Fire, flipping cars around and stuff. So great fun. But again, as I said, if you look at the final sequence when it reached the screen, which is what you're seeing now, the G.I. Joe sequence, well, this is how it looks like. And of course, there's a lot of VFX involved, computer-generated image, removal, wire removal, and so on and so on. So compositing, of course, because these characters have been added afterwards. Therefore, I was, again, throughout my camera career for 11 years involved in that sort of things. And the fact that there was more and more VFX involved really sort of sparked certain curiosity, and I decided to shift over to VFX. And that proved really useful, very beneficial for my own practice of VFX later on, as a matter of fact. And the reason, again, is, we're going to have a look in detail, is simply because the knowledge, the very intimate knowledge of cameras and lenses is essential for the practice of VFX. These are not two separate things, okay? Further to the course, here is a little clip of one of the workshops we've done previously, so you can see a little bit of the equipment we use. There will be a bit of green screen, naturally, lights, lenses. So these are the brilliant acting and performances of our studio assistant. Part of the process also is to try and replicate existing shots, as I mentioned before. So there's a lot of effort and kind of production value as well. So we have a treadmill. What you see now is the shot being turned into a point cloud, which is also part of the process. So quite a nice, few nice toys that we will be using throughout that workshop. There you go. So some of the tools that we will be using. Another clip that I would like to share with you is this one, which is actually provided by ILM, who made originally the Star Wars and so on. The reason why I want to share that is because in that little behind the scene, we can, in few seconds, see how the live action, so essentially the filming on set, is related to VFX. Everything is essentially, at the end of the day, one single image, which is made of multiple components. One of these components is naturally the live action, the original piece of footage, which is integrated all together with computer-generated image, performance from actors, and so on. So this really emphasizes the fact that regardless where we stand, whether we work on set as a camera person or behind a computer as a VFX person, everything is actually one single comprehensive workflow. And as a VFX person, for instance, you shouldn't consider yourself as just a computer person. You are first and foremost a moving image maker, so digital moving image maker, and we all are, as a matter of fact, including a camera operator, cinematographer. This is actually the same image. And for that image to take shape, to come together again convincingly for the audience to believe this artificial image to be true as if it had always been in front of the camera, well, the VFX person as well as the cinematographer need to have this reciprocal knowledge of each field. So VFX people need to know about the camera, camera people need to know about VFX. That's the idea. In that course, actually, there are two aspects to cinematography for VFX. The first one, naturally, is how do we shoot VFX plates? Okay, so one of the most common VFX plates is chroma key, also known as blue screen or green screen, for instance. The other aspect is the VFX Shot Design, which is more a VFX Supervisor type of task. The idea there, based on our case study, is to try to figure out what's the best strategy, the best way to create, conceive, design a VFX shot. So before it's even being recorded by the camera. And there are many ways to achieve the same shot, many strategies, many options. Naturally, for a VFX supervisor, the idea is to find the best, the most effective way, which is essentially, time and money, as always. But also in terms of technique, and for your VFX team to have the best assets to work with. The other aspect of the course is cinematography indeed for VFX artists, and therefore it's the knowledge of the cinematography related to the activity of visual effect. Because in fact, the best way to understand visual effects is simply that VFX is cinematography only made with computers. Because as I said, at the end of the day, throughout the chain, this is the same images, whether we stand behind a computer or whether we stand behind a camera. Okay. Likewise, for VFX Supervisor, as I mentioned previously, there is great benefit to know a lot about cinematography, cameras and lenses, and reversely for cinematographers to know about VFX. Okay, so here with that process, we really try to bridge two segments of the film industry, which never really get to talk to each other, simply because different times, different time of production, different location naturally. So it's very important to trigger that communication between the two field. So I'm going to go to the content of the course, and I'm going to conclude by the why we need that. Okay, so what we're going to do in the course, naturally, there will be a little bit of theory, and for that, essentially, I've created that map, the picture pathway, somehow, and the idea is, in one go, to be able to go through the essential parameters, so in fact, everything is there, the essential parameters of the camera from the scene to the delivery, right? And when I say scene, well, that's true for 3D scene as well, because the concept of scene is quite universal. When you work as a 3D VFX artist, you also use virtual cameras in the platform, 3ds Max. It's true somehow for animators as well, so anything virtual, whether you create the image from a live action scene or a virtual one, we kind of use the same parameters, the same factors, the same tools. So this, in terms of theory, this is what I'm going to use to make it as visual as possible. We are all visual people, so theory, I think, shouldn't be, sort of boring, lengthy written bits of explanation. I hope with that very visual approach of theory, the theory of images, we can all be on the same page fairly easily. But these are essential parameters that as VFX cinematographer alike and VFX supervisor and filmmakers as well, we really need to know. Okay, alongside with the theoretical aspect, well, we'll go indeed, as I mentioned, into case studies. So case studies are existing shots, and I've kind of broken down in 6 different types. Okay, so it's simply to make things a little bit easier. One of my favorite actually is probably clones and twins. So every single time that you have to have clones in a film, well, of course you have to think a little bit ahead out how to make that happen. So here is Orphan Black, which is a series which I'm sure some of you have seen. And here's behind the scene. And what's great about what we see now is that, in fact, to achieve this cloning, so it's the same actress with different haircuts and wardrobe outfit, but essentially they employed a variety of technique. It's hardly ever the same time, the same methods or technique employed. And this is entirely down to the shot itself, the content, the complexity, the number of clones, the angle, the light sometimes. So all that has to be devised beforehand by the cinematographers, filmmakers, and VFX supervisors. So it's a conversation of at least 3 departments that needs to take place. So here there's the crane in the mirror, which has been removed, and so on. So this is one of our case studies. You see is actually a few more. That again is probably more my favorite, simply because typically the cloning, for instance, is one challenge, one VFX challenge, which is maybe one of the most demanding in terms of complexity. It's a very tricky puzzle at times. So we'll make use of those existing shots, case study, to fuel our workshop, so that we can replicate, we can go through the process of high-profile production. Our actual pathway in that course is made of sort of 5 milestones, 5 modules. So indeed, as I mentioned, the theory, the previs, which is kind of the prep of the shot. So how are we going to break down the shot? I'm using is actually a very simple 3D previs app, which you can run on tablet, on your phone actually, and computer as well. So Shot Designer, Shot Pro, which is very, very intuitive, simple to use, but we can in fact create a sort of storyboard beforehand of the number of played shot, how we want to film it. Naturally, the tools, I'm going to go briefly into what these tools are, and then the shooting, so the actual filming in front of green screen. This is an important part of the course. And as a sort of conclusion, we'll go into a little bit of visual effect of these shots. So that's the whole point, is to bring these shots forward to the post-production phase and see a little bit how they stand, how well we've done in terms of preparation and filming. So that sort of round-trip workflow, which I mentioned before, should allow us to have a very comprehensive understanding of what these different segments of the film industry, from camera to post-production, how they articulate or how they actually should communicate as well. So all that hopefully to make you guys better filmmakers, better VFX artists and supervisors, better cinematographers, all in your respective field, but all making the same image. Alongside that, so I mentioned the tools, here they are. You've seen in the clip previously the actual tool that we will be looking and using. So there is naturally the camera, the lenses, there is our tiny studio in Shepherd's Bush, lighting, of course. There is the VFX specific tools that we'll have a look into. We have also a bit of a grip system, so not that beautiful telescopic crane that wouldn't fit our studio, but you've seen in the clip we have nonetheless a little crane, a little bit of dolly tracks and so on. And also the apps, because this tends to be a little bit overlooked, but actually apps are getting more and more useful for the VFX life and the professional activity of cinematographers as well. So it's very interesting to have a look in these fairly new tools and how convenient they can be when it comes to the filming part of the project. We'll have a look also into the industry. So for people who really, don't necessarily know how things work on set, which is a slightly different organization than in VFX facilities. So for VFX Supervisor, who have potentially a good background in VFX, but not necessarily a good understanding of how things happen on set, well, we're going to have a little bit of background, have a look at how things are organized and who you need to talk to when you want to make those shots happen. So that's essentially a little bit of industry, background industry, history, brief history also of VFX. So we started with people like Méliès, so the first silent era film, first VFX, and then moving on to matte painting, which is effectively painting on a window, literally on glass. Then miniature model, so we're looking at Blade Runner right now. So at this point in time, no 3D whatsoever. And then came the first CG, computer-generated images. So Terminator, you probably remember that, sort of a liquid Terminator. It was also in the pioneering era, pretty much. Jurassic Park was a sort of important milestone, and so on. So before all CG, everything was done in front of the camera, and then things evolved gradually towards computer-generated image. To this day, where in fact, I believe that the best possible VFX are the ones that really truly combine both. So when it's just computer-generated image, well, it still tends to look a bit artificial. And I think that the most convincing VFX often are a combination of both. Just like here, for instance, Peter Jackson production. All right, so that's a little bit our journey. We'll have also a look into the future of that conversation, that sort of interaction between cinematography and visual effect, which may actually lie into light field technology. So at the moment, light field technology is led by a company which is called Lightro, but not only, there are many universities across the world who are working on that as well, another company, private company, but it may well be a direction worth to keep an eye on, simply because the light field technology will probably challenge to a great extent this relationship between VFX and cinematography. So, well, we'll have a look into that as well to try to figure out what comes next for us, the cinematographer, filmmakers, and VFX artists alike. So that's the future of VFX and cinematography altogether. All right, so I'm going to move on now to the why, really, of cinematography and VFX, because maybe for some of you the question and the why there is a necessity for VFX to know about cinematography and cinematographer to know about VFX. If it's a little bit unclear, I'm going to try and make that a little bit clearer. So I'm going to start with this graph, which intend to essentially outline what's required for creative industry people. So again, VFX cinematographer, filmmakers. There are, as I see it, three fundamental aspects about our craft, regardless what this is, behind the camera or behind the computer. There are the tools. The tools, software for VFX artists, cameras for cinematographers. The tools actually evolves. It's a very specific knowledge, but technology evolves, especially with digital camera. Softwares come and go and develop. So it's something which is necessary, but I would say it's the bare minimum. If you're a VFX person, well, you're expected to know the platform that you use, be it compositing or 3D modeling and so on. As a cinematographer, same thing, you have to be aware of the new development, new release of tools. But again, it's a very specific knowledge, right? I don't think that a VFX person needs to know necessarily about camera or the tool of the cinematographer, and I don't think that the cinematographer necessarily need to know about the VFX tools, because again, that is very specific, okay? That essentially belongs to your trade, your craft. Now, when it comes to the method, well, the method is a bit broader than the tool, because the method is a sort of series of technique, and also coming from experience, your own experience, but also the experience of people who work in that field before you, and that came up with ways of doing things. So it goes beyond the tools, it's how to use the tool. So these are the methods, again, techniques, experience, and this is already somewhat of a more universal knowledge, right? Because if these methods are well crafted, if there is a practice which works well across multiple situations, well, therefore it is more universal. It's something that you can re-employ again and again, and regardless the tool you use, say maybe you move on to a new platform in terms of software, or you switch to a different camera, well, the ways of using camera, broadly speaking, in terms of method or the way of using, say, in 2D compositing or doing keying, well, that can be transferred easily across multiple platforms or regardless the tool you employ. So these are the methods. And again, because it's more universal, I think this is an area where it kind of matters for the cinematographer to have an understanding of what the VFX method might be, and for the VFX people to have an understanding of what the cinematography methods and technique might be. Okay, so again, as much as the tools are specific to the trade and probably is not really relevant for each other to really know whether you're a cinematographer or VFX person, to know what specifically how to use the tool of the other field, the other guy. In terms, when it comes to method, I think it really matters to begin to have an interest and understanding for VFX artists to have an understanding of the method of cinematography, and for cinematographer to have an understanding of methods of VFX. Not to the point that you could do it yourself, because that's not necessarily your job, but to a point that you increase, you widen your understanding, and you begin to have a bigger picture of the entire workflow of making images. Now, when it comes to the third point, which is the vision, I think this is really where we have to come together, because the vision is indeed based to the observation and the analytical skill of what an image is made of. Okay, so that is more related to the creative aspect, but also to the delivery as a whole of that image. Because as I said previously, the image that we create at the end of the day is one single image. And of course it starts at some point on set. Maybe if your image is meant to be composited, well, there will be a little bit of live action, live footage, which is created by the cinematographer. Maybe it's going to take on board a few computer-generated images. So all these elements may come from camera and computers and eventually being combined. So because we're creating the same image, this is important that we speak the same language and we have the same understanding of that image, so how that image is made of. And the vision is really essential for cinematographers as much as VFX. So the vision is, again, your ability to observe, so observation skill, which is to understand the world around us, how light comes on an object, how things interact, what a shadow is made of, the quality of light, composition, and so on. So as VFX artists and cinematographer alike, and filmmakers, I would really recommend, we need to know that, all of us, at the same level, because it's the same craft. And as I said previously, in a way, doing VFX is essentially doing cinematography with computer, but it's the same thing. It's important also to be able to, alongside the observation, to analyze, so to break down that image in different parameters, essentially going into the DNA of that image. And ultimately the goal, especially when a shot has VFX in it, is to create something which is photorealistic. So we have to develop a photorealism expertise in a way. And this is complete universal knowledge. So it's worth spending a little bit of time in that, because again, once you know what images are made of, once you know understand how to break down images, well, that really is something that will last forever, because these notions are true completely across the board, regardless the tool and regardless the method. So there is a sort of a hierarchy in a way in terms of knowledge: the specific, the worth sharing, and the absolutely essential to know and to have in common, right? So that's how I would put it. So related directly to what I've just said, in fact, when we create these VFX shots, artificial image, in fact, well, we have to deliver something which is beyond realistic in a way. It doesn't have to be just realistic, it has to be photorealistic, and it's a term which is being used in the industry very often. We need to create photorealistic shot, not just realistic, photorealistic. So essentially, that means it's meant to represent the world, but the world has seen through a camera. That sounds a bit awkward, because you could say, well, so long that I'm creating something that looks like the world, it's fine. No, in fact, it has to be the image has to look like the world, but as if it had been shot through a camera. This is when it gets photorealistic. And I'm going to explain a little bit why and what that means. So with this diagram, I'm breaking down, I hope in very simple ways, this relation and what's implied in the photorealistic term. So once upon a time, human beings, we are in the world, we look at the world, and that is essentially a very direct, straightforward relation between the audience and the environment, the world around us. That's us, the audience, the real world. And then once upon a time, a little bit later, maybe 100 years ago or so, we started creating pictures, still pictures at first, and then moving pictures. And this was recorded by a camera, and then display projected on a screen. So the setup today hasn't changed much, because we still have cameras, digital cameras, looking at the world, and the content is being broadcast on screen. Variety of screen, cinema, TV, mobile, tablet, name it, whatever. So here we go. Now we have us, the audience, still looking at the world, but the world seen through a camera and projected on a screen. So we have a sort of proxy which stands as, in a way, as a human being looking at the world, but this is a proxy, this is the camera recording the world for us and then being seen later on through a screen. So that's a bit the evolution of that relation. And the reason why I'm showing that now is simply because when we look at the screen, and since ever the intention all the way up to virtual reality, VR, which is a 360 setup, so interactive 360 viewing experience, well, the intention remained the same. Since the early days, it's about trying to create the illusion of the real world. But the thing is, going a little bit into, audience psychology or trying to understand how the brain works, well, we never really forget the fact that there is a device. The device is either the VR headset that you wear or the screen. We never, at the back of our mind, even if we empathize, even if we emotionally interact with the content of what we see, well, it's clear that we never actually take what we see for the real world. There's never a complete oblivion of that. And there is what's known as a suspension of disbelief, which is the moment where we indeed relate to the content. But somewhere, somehow, at the back of our mind, there is always the notion, thankfully, that there is a device which we actually looking at. So hardly ever we really take the content for the real world, okay? But to make sure to help basically that we can have a relation project and have emotional empathy to the content, then in fact the presence of the camera is needed, in a sense that the visual signature of the device that capture the world is kind of needed to ensure that we accept the presence of the device. So it sounds a bit absurd, but in fact it's completely logical. To accept the fact that we look at the world through a device and help make it easier to believe that it's the actual world, it's actually easier when we take into account the fact that this has been effectively seen, witnessed by a proxy, sort of, in that case the camera, proxy of a presence, which could be a human being, a camera operator, but the camera is looking at the world and then essentially relay that vision of the world through a device. So that's how the brain works, and it makes it much easier when you look at the screen to accept basically the presence of that artificial device, when in fact the presence of the camera is known, acknowledged. So a bit later on, we started making complete artificial image that had never seen any camera, never seen any reality. And this is VFX, computer-generated image. So essentially coming straight out of the blue, straight out of the computer, the heart of a machine. There's never been any reality to it. And this is displayed on our screen and seen to the audience. And we realized when we started doing that it was not really working so well. So the first attempt, if you look at the early days of CG, well, it doesn't look really convincing. And you could say, well, it's simply because the technology was not there, it was not realistic enough. Well, here is the question, what realistic enough means? So to make our CG, computer-generated image, and VFX alike more realistic, does that mean we have to add more real world into it? Well, but what does that mean exactly? Do we have to make our texture? Do we have to make our light artificial, computer-generated light and texture and modeling and mesh and so on? Do we have to make that more like the real world? Potentially, it could mean exactly that. So to add a little bit more reality into our artificial images. And that is not sufficient, still not sufficient yet, because again, we're looking at complete artificial image that pretend being the real world, but there is a missing element. The missing element is that whatever these artificial images are, we need, as an audience, looking through a screen, so through a device, we need to feel that whatever is in there was or has been at some point a physical place, location where a human being or a camera operator, for that matter, could have been and sort of report from that place, okay? So that's where the presence of the camera is essential, is that if we don't feel as an audience that what we see is a physical place where we could have stepped in and witness unfolding the events, well, if that feeling does not occur, well, therefore, the realism doesn't work. So you can do, add as much real world or realism as you want in your VFX images. If you can't bring your image to a point where the audience can feel that it's an actual location, that someone could have been there and record the scene, well, that's not going to work. And that, again, is where the cinematography comes in. So alternatively, if these images are not fully computer-generated image in the sense that they are composite of live action, which is exactly what we do in 2D, for instance. So bits and pieces of real world, green screen, chroma key put together alongside a bit of CG. Even if you do that, you could say, well, all these elements individually are coming from the real world, are live action, so if I put that together, that should look right, okay? Well, same problem, because you have to give to the audience a feeling that this is actually or must or had been at some point a scene where the audience or a camera operator, someone could have stepped in and witness what's unfolding. Okay, so it's not just about adding all the pieces of the puzzle together. This is not enough. Even if you try to make that more like the real world, so more realistic, you still need to give to the audience the feeling that this is an actual scene. At least once it has been something real in the real world. And to give the audience that feeling again is necessary to accept the device of the screen, basically. Okay, so it makes much easier to accept the device of the screen, the artificiality of the screen or the VR headset, when we in fact get the sense that this content actually was a real physical scene. And to get that feeling, well, that's where you need to add the presence of the camera. And that's where the relation between cinematography and VFX and the need for VFX artists to know about cinematography is so essential, is because you can do, as good as you can be as good as you want in Maya, 3D softwares, or 2D compositing. You can do amazing assembly work or generate amazing CG. In terms of compositing especially, you must again give to the audience the feeling that that scene that you create is a physical one. Okay, so as if it could have been seen or recorded by someone, by something. So the presence of the camera actually facilitates the acceptation of the artificiality of the screen. Okay, so this is a bit, you could say theoretical or abstract, but this is very important to understand the sort of psychology or mechanic dynamic of the brain and the viewing experience to be able to be a good cinematographer and a good VFX artist. And that entirely justify the need for VFX artists to know about cinematography and cinematographer to know about compositing and 3D as well. So that essentially the why. Okay, I'm going to illustrate that with real images to conclude our webinar. So I have like 3 films actually and a few pictures there. I'm going to start with my pictures. So these 2 there, you have Blade Runner 1982, and you have one of the Star Trek, J.J. Abrams' Star Trek, so the reboot 10 years ago. Arguably, I like both films, so no subjective judgment there. But in technical terms, this one is realistic, so or real, maybe real enough for some people, and this one is photorealistic. So when I look at that image, see, I've picked up those 2 images because obviously they are kind of quite similar in terms of situation, in terms of action. The Star Trek one clearly has something which makes us feel, and this is not subjective, this is really technical, you potentially have the feeling there watching that image that there's been a camera, there was someone there was something, it's an actual scene. And the reason why we feel that way, again, it's purely technical, it's not just a subjective creative license thing, is that there is a lot in that image that bear the visual signature of a camera, of a device that optically acquire the scene. We have the lens flare, we have the defocus, we have the optical compression, and so on and so on. Here, we're dealing with something which is more akin to a painting, okay? So I don't get the same feeling. I love it, I think it's beautiful. Some could argue, well, hang on a minute, it's simply because it's 1982, right? They didn't know how to do it. Well, not quite, okay? There's a little bit of course, technology and stuff like that into it, but it really is a different of vision and approach as well. More recently, and to outline a little bit this comparison, well, this is probably something that everyone knows, which is Avatar, probably now 9 years ago, if I'm not mistaken. And here is a picture from another film. I'm going to show you an extract. We have 2 sort of not similar environment, but it's sort of scenery, green scenery and stuff, same thing here. Here is one which I think is photorealistic. It's entirely computer-generated image. There is no live action whatsoever in here. And over here, well, it's also completely CG as well. So I don't think this is very convincing. For me, I'm kind of watching more, feels to me that it's more a cartoon kind of things, whereas here there is something more real. And again, although this is Avatar and they had a lot of money probably to do that, here is the work of one single person. Is actually a Spanish artist who's done that essentially as a hobby on the weekend. And what you see here is a still from that film, which I really recommend. What's funny about that film is that the year of production is identical to Avatar. So this is kind of 9-year-old, and it's everything that we see now is computer-generated images. So just going a little bit further, every single shot there is coming from a computer, including that. It's again 2009, so the exact same year of Avatar's release, and to this day, that little short film, again made by one single person, remain my absolute reference in terms of computer-generated image. I think there is an optical quality to it, an organic quality to it, which I haven't seen anywhere else. And it's all down, not the tool, okay? Because again, in terms of tools, James Cameron had more than probably anyone ever had to play with. No, it's down to the vision. It's down to the vision of that one artist who really properly understand that concept of cinematography and VFX together. So for your VFX image to be really truly convincing and credible, you have to make the audience believe that it's been once a real scene. So as if we could have walked in that scene, okay? As soon as you create that feeling, then it becomes credible, believable. And to create the feeling that this is a real scene, although it's completely fake, completely artificial, well, you have to look at it as you, human being, you would look at it. In fact, no, you need to look at it as the camera would look at it. Because of course, the experience of that image that we create, the audience is going to look at it through a screen. So therefore, again, although it sounds a little bit surprising, the presence of the camera, so the fact that your image is being seen by a camera, even if the image is completely artificial and has never actually met a camera, if you make the audience feel that there's been a camera there, well, it's going to help to accept the presence of the screen, so of the viewing device, okay? So as soon as you understand that mechanic, all the rest is obvious, and all the answers are essentially provided by the scene. I often say to my VFX students, when they don't know where to start or they are stuck a little bit, they struggle with an issue, I always refer to the real world. I always recommend people to think about the image again as a physical scene, not only seen by naked eyes by a human being, but seen by a camera. And then that provides immediately all the answers in terms of light, focus, exposure, depth of field, and so on. Okay, so I really believe that what we're looking at, although some of it is a bit artificial, so you see there's water floating, beautiful acoustics effect and stuff, and again, it looks extremely organic, extremely optical, real, but none of it is. All right, so going a little bit at the beginning, same thing. It's a 12 minutes long short film. It's called The Third and the Seventh, and I warmly recommend everyone to have a look at that, because again, I really believe that it's one of the most beautiful 3D production to this point. 9 years old as Avatar. So on this point, there is no argument. No one can say, oh, okay, well, but it's because Avatar is not looking so good now because it's 9 years ago and so on. This is made the exact same year. And it has an incredible quality to it, which Avatar doesn't have, despite of the fact that a lot of money, a lot of people, and so on. And I believe it's simply because James Cameron is a scientist. He also explores the ocean and stuff like that. So the man really had a great contribution. They made immense breakthrough in terms of motion capture in Avatar, but in terms of vision, to produce that beautiful, organic, realistic, photorealistic vision, well, it takes exactly that. It takes the understanding of what cinematography is for VFX and for cinematographers to understand a little bit what the VFX is as well. So that is the very reason why we are doing that. Likewise, here you have actually a showreel, of which I've done the showreel clinic recently, so that's the final shot. And this is sort of, to me, illustrate really something that doesn't work for that matter. So clearly the artists here know how to use the tool, know also how to use the method, but there is clearly an absence of photorealism. So it's essentially all the pieces which are originally live action elements. So you could say, well, surely if all the individual elements are originally live action, well, if we put them together, that's going to look good and that's going to look real because there is no CG. Well, no, it's not enough because this is just patching up pieces of the puzzle without any understanding of the cinematography. So for that shot to look real, it has to be put together as if a camera had been there looking at the real scene. But clearly here it's a shot that doesn't work because we have a depth of field that doesn't match the optical compression or the focal length. So again, as a VFX person, you have to have a good intimate understanding of these notions, which are cinematography notion, to be able to do a good shot. That shot doesn't work because, again, there is no cinematography in it. Okay, it's a simple collage of multiple layers. So again, the artist knows how to use the tool, knows some method, but clearly doesn't have the vision, doesn't have the cinematographic optical understanding of what an image is. These multiple plates, there are actually 4 live action plates there, they don't match. Ultimately, they don't match. There is defocus apply where it shouldn't, there is perspective, optical compression, mismatch, and so on. Okay, so I will let you play back probably a recording of this video if you want to try and analyze that sequence. Interestingly, and for the same reason, the handheld camera work that sometimes we see in feature films, so complete fiction. Here is Children of Man, which actually has a lot of VFX, invisible VFX in it. And a lot of the sequence is actually handheld. And that sort of confirms the way our brain works, because think about it. Here is a little bit later in that sequence, we even have like blood on the camera. Well, hang on a minute. When we run, you know, as human being in the world, the image is not shaky, right? And if we have the misfortune of being in a situation where you would see that, well, you actually wouldn't see it because only the camera, you know, can have those defocus drop of blood. So essentially what we get to see from the camera here has nothing to do with the way we see it as a human being, as we experience it as a human being. So again, that really outlined the fact that whenever you use a handheld camera, so very shaky camera, and the fact that this typical handheld camera work makes the sequence more realistic, it's not because it looks more like the way we see the real world, not at all. Again, as a human being, we never, if we run in the real world, actually our brain compensates the motion, so we don't get to see the world shaking so much as we see it there. So this is in fact the same code where the audience is given to feel the presence of the camera and therefore accept more easily the presence of the screen, because it feels for the audience that someone has been there for real and is reporting that content has been recorded, that content for us. So all that, the fact that the sequence like this one, which is again with a lot of VFX in it, although it doesn't look like it, there is loads of it, well, it feels more real simply out of the presence of the camera. Not because it's in fact more realistic in a sense that it's not actually real, it's not any close to the human or subjective human vision, not at all. It clearly is the vision of the camera. So the presence of the camera, okay, which we can feel by many ways, the fact that it is so shaky, the fact that we have those defocus drops there, and the optical compression and the lens flare and so on, all that betrays the presence of the camera. And surprisingly, it's far from being a contradiction actually, surprisingly, it actually makes the audience accept more easily the whole experience. Okay, so that is quite typical. Handheld camera work in feature really sort of immediately increased this feeling of truth, a little bit like documentary style it's called actually, as if actually what we're looking at is being produced by a TV crew reporting for a war or something like that. Okay, so I hope like this experience, is convincing enough to, now make sense of the benefit of cinematography for visual effects. This is indeed going to conclude our webinar, and I'm looking forward to see you hopefully next month, January or October later this year, to take part to this cinematography for visual effects at Escape Studio, Pearson College, London. Bye-bye, take care.